All right, so diving into a topic that's, well, it's kind of a perennial head scratcher for anyone who's, pondered the whole philosophy of art thing.
Yeah.
Plato's take on beauty and art.
Big one.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And especially for someone with a philosophical background like yours, it's got to be fascinating to kind of
Pathos.
untangle what he's getting at. Now, we talk about Plato's aesthetics, but that term itself, it's more of a modern label.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, it's definitely a more recent way of framing it. But we can still use it as a lens. I mean, he was grappling with these core questions, beauty, what it means to imitate something in art, the whole idea of inspiration. And these are things that are right up your alley, philosophically speaking.
Exactly. And that's what makes this deep dive so interesting, at least for me, because, on the surface, there's this apparent contradiction in Plato. Like, beauty is, in his view, this thing it's almost like right next to the ultimate good.
Mm-hmm.
But then you've got art, poetry especially, and he paints it as this almost dangerous thing. So how do those two fit together? How can they both be true in his aesthetics, if we can even call it that?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's like this puzzle that Plato throws at us, and it's exactly the kind of thing that keeps philosophers going for centuries.
For sure. So to kind of map out our deep dive here, we're going to start with how Plato understood beauty itself, what it is, why it matters so much to him. Then we'll get into this whole mimesis thing, imitation, representation, all that, and how it ties into artistic creation. And finally, we'll wrap up with this idea of divine inspiration and what role that might play, particularly for the artist. We'll be drawing on a bunch of different dialogues, trying to get a well-rounded view.
Sounds like a plan.
All right, so let's kick things off with beauty. Now, one thing that's super important, I think, to grasp from the get-go is that when Plato and the Greeks in general used the word kalon,
Ah, yes.
it wasn't exactly the same as how we use beautiful in English.
Right, it's not a one-to-one translation, for sure.
Yeah, there's some overlap, but kalon had this broader scope. It often carried these ideas of noble, admirable, especially when you're talking ethics.
Exactly. It wasn't just about, like, sensory pleasure or something.
Right, you could talk about a kalon face, sure, or a statue.
Of course, yeah.
But, you see in the Phaedrus, he uses it for like a kalon spoon.
No, spoon. Interesting.
Or a kalon grassy spot to relax. So it's this wider concept than just pure aesthetic appeal. And actually, I think it's important to point out, he uses kalon more for physical forms than what we might think of as art today.
Right, right. And don't forget about palos. That's more specifically about physical attractiveness. The kind of thing that Plato was, well, a little wary of because it can lead to, all sorts of desires and complications.
Yeah, for sure. So in a lot of his dialogues, you see this real focus on trying to figure out kalon, like, what is it to be kalon? What is the essence of beauty?
What is the underlying thing that makes all beautiful things beautiful while itself remaining free from ugliness? That's kind of the big question lurking in the background, isn't it?
It is. It's like the search for that core definition. And that's where we get into the Hippias Major, right?
Yeah.
This whole dialogue where Socrates is going back and forth with Hippias, trying to pin down what beauty is. And it's inconclusive, right?
It is. But it's a fascinating ride getting there.
Yeah, we see Hippias throwing out all these definitions, like a beautiful young woman is beautiful. And Socrates, of course, is like, nope, that's just an example, not a definition. But, I've always wondered, some scholars have pointed out that Socrates doesn't seem to criticize Hippias' method as much as he does with other people in other dialogues. Is Hippias actually trying to propose an exemplar of beauty, a kind of standard, instead of just a singular example?
That's a good point. Maybe Hippias is tapping into those Homeric ideals. The beautiful woman, the distinguished tripod, the swift mare things that were really valued by the Greek aristocracy.
Yeah, makes you think. So anyway, after Hippias kind of strikes out, Socrates tries his hand at defining beauty. And one of the definitions he proposes is that beauty is basically what is appropriate. And while that ultimately gets refuted, it's interesting how it foreshadows later philosophical discussions. I mean, it makes me think of Kant's idea of dependent beauty, where something's beauty is tied to how well it fulfills its purpose.
It's like a preview of things to come, right? And what's really striking is that in Plato's generally accepted works, beauty is never completely absorbed into just the good or the appropriate or the beneficial. It's like he's holding on to a distinction, kind of like Kant does later.
Oh, totally.
Yeah.
But it's not like he's saying beauty is just a sensory thing either.
No, absolutely not.
The fact that he's even trying to connect it to the good, to analyze it intellectually, it shows he's not a simple sensualist.
Right. And that's why scholars like James Porter consider both him and Aristotle as formalists, because they shifted the way people thought about art theory back then, moving away from just the senses and towards something more, well, formal.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, okay, even though we don't get a perfect answer in the Hippias Major, we can start to see some key things about how Plato understands beauty. And these ideas pop up all over his philosophy. First, beauty works in a way that's similar to his forms. It's got this objective reality. It's not just subjective opinion.
Right. And we can understand it through the same kind of thinking and questioning, that dialectical process that Socrates uses. He's not just looking for an opinion, he's trying to get at the underlying essence of beauty.
Right. And the second thing,
Well, while beauty is like the forms, it's not just one form among many. It's got this special status. Like, it's almost tied to the form of the good, even though Socrates argues that they're not the same thing.
yeah, it's like beauty has this direct line to the good in a way that other forms might not. And the third thing we noticed,
Well, it's interesting how, even though Socrates and Hippias do use art as an example of beautiful things, they don't treat art as the main case or the defining case.
that's true.
Plato's talking about beauty a lot of the time separately from his discussions of art. Of course, the Republic and the Laws are big exceptions to that.
Yeah. So we have this form-like nature of beauty, the link to the good, and the fact that art isn't central to its definition. It really sets beauty apart in Plato's whole metaphysical system. It's almost like a bridge, right?
Between what we see and what we understand, yeah.
Exactly. And that brings us to the symposium, which is another big one for understanding how Plato thought about beauty. And in this dialogue, beauty is presented as like the goal of love's journey.
Through Diotima's teachings, right? She talks about this incredible ascent of the soul. And it starts with being attracted to one person's beauty.
Right. Physical beauty.
Right. And then it expands to appreciating all beautiful bodies, then to the beauty of souls, then to the beauty of laws and knowledge, and finally to the beauty itself.
Whoa.
It's a powerful image, right? It's this journey that starts with the senses but can lead you to something purely intellectual.
It's like beauty can actually be the starting point for philosophy.
Exactly.
And it's interesting that in this dialogue, Diotima even says the poet's work is like a kind of intellectual procreation.
Really?
It's like they're giving birth to wisdom and virtues. And she even asks, who wouldn't envy Homer or Hesiod? But it's interesting, in both the Symposium and the Philebus, when they talk about pure beauty, the examples are almost never poems.
So we've got this tension already, right? Beauty can lead to this higher understanding, but poetry doesn't seem to quite fit into that picture.
Exactly. And that tension becomes even more obvious in the Republic, when he's talking about how to educate those guardians in the ideal city. At first, he's all about censoring the content of poetry, especially stuff from Homer and the tragedies, the gods doing bad things, being bad examples.
Yeah, can't have the guardians getting corrupted by those stories.
Right. But even while he's talking about content, you start to see hints of this deeper critique. Like when he's talking about stories where gods disguise themselves, Socrates says a god wouldn't change their form and calls the god who does that at Goethe's a sorcerer, a trickster.
Interesting.
It's like right there, he's connecting poetry with sorcery, and he's introducing the idea of impersonation. And then he shifts gears and starts focusing on the style of narration. He separates out pure narration, mimesis, and a combo of the two. And by doing that, it's almost like he's saying mimesis is this deviation from normal narration from the get-go.
Right. It's like he's already signaling that something's not quite right with it.
Exactly. And then he defines imitation as impersonation, making yourself like someone else. He says when Homer's recounting the speeches of his characters, he's making himself like them, speaking as if he were someone else, hiding his own voice.
So the issue is that you're taking on the persona of someone else, and if that persona is a bad one, then it could lead to you becoming bad yourself.
Right. And he actually lists all sorts of things that shouldn't be imitated. Villains, sure, but also women, slaves, animals, even inanimate objects.
Well, hold on. How does imitating say, a musical instrument make you a worse person?
That's a good question. It's a little unclear how imitating, say, machinery would lead you to becoming more like a machine. I guess he's assuming all impersonation is somehow messed up.
It does seem like a pretty sweeping claim.
Yeah. But the point is, this whole argument really plays on the fact that mimesis can be both what the writer does and what the performer does. The idea that imitating a bad character makes you bad, that really only works if you think of mimesis as performance. But not everyone in Athens was an actor.
Right. Most people were just watching.
Exactly. So to get rid of all drama, Plato has to argue that there's something wrong with the plays themselves, even if they're just read, not performed.
Ah, I see.
And that's where he brings in this idea that the potential for performance is enough to make them bad, even if no one's actually acting them out.
And that's where the religious language comes in at the end, right? When he talks about banishing the poet who can imitate everything.
Yeah, it's this really strong statement, like those mimetic works are toxic just by existing.
Wow. So book 3 is basically laying the groundwork for an aesthetic judgment. It's saying imitation, specifically impersonation, is a formal concept that we need to think about, and that it can make poetry worse, but mainly when it's imitating characters who are morally bad.
Right. And it's important to remember that the kind of imitation they're talking about here, it's not just any kind of similarity or likeness. It's all about this specific thing of impersonating another person.
Got it.
But then things get even more interesting when we get to Book 10 of the Republic,
Oh.
because there, mimesis takes on a whole new meaning. Suddenly, it's more about picturing things, creating copies, like a painting of a couch or a poem describing a scene. It's the relationship between the real thing and its image.
Ah, so this time it's visual art and poetry together.
Yeah. And this new understanding of mimesis is directly connected to his idea of the tripartite soul, reason, spirit, appetite.
Right. And he explicitly links it back to that earlier discussion by talking about the different parts of the soul.
Yeah, the whole point of Book 10 is to show that poetry, just like painting, is only imitating the appearance of things.
So it's far removed from truth.
Exactly. And because of that, this kind of mimesis corrupts the soul. It makes the rational part weaker, less able to control those desires and impulses.
That's a big claim.
It is. And it's his new justification for kicking mimetic poetry out of the ideal city.
Okay, but how does he get there? How does he actually argue that?
So it all comes down to this three-tiered hierarchy of, existence, I guess.
Right.
At the top level, you've got the form itself, like the form of a couch. And this is created by, some divine power.
Okay.
Then on the second level, you have the actual things in the world, like a specific couch made by a carpenter.
Uh-huh.
And then at the bottom, you have the representations of that couch, like a painting of it.
Yeah.
And that's where the imitation happens.
So the painting is an imitation, but the couch made by the carpenter is not.
Right. The carpenter's trying to make his couch according to the form. He's not just copying something else. But the painting, it's just capturing how the couch looks from one specific angle.
I'm starting to see where he's going with this. So it's like the painting can't give you the true nature of the couch, only a limited view of it.
Exactly. It's just the appearance. And he uses the same logic for a painter who paints a shoemaker. The painter might not know anything about actually making shoes, so the painting is just showing what a shoemaker looks like to someone who's completely clueless.
So the imitation is based on ignorance, not real knowledge.
Right. And then he throws in this other hierarchy that's a little strange. He's got the user, someone who actually knows how to use something, like a flute player at the top.
Okay.
Then the maker, who made the flute.
Uh-huh.
And then at the bottom, again, you have the imitator.
So the flute player knows more than the flute maker. That's interesting.
Yeah, it's a bit odd. Some scholars think it might be a religious thing, like the flute and the bridle are associated with Athena, so maybe the imitator is seen as opposed to the divine somehow. But anyway, after talking about painting, Socrates goes back to poetry. And he basically says that Homer didn't have any real knowledge. He didn't teach anything useful.
Oh, wow. Taking on Homer directly.
Yeah. And his point is that poetry, just like painting, is only imitating appearances. Because if someone who doesn't know anything can write great poetry, then poetry can't require knowledge, right?
Right.
And the funny thing is, Plato agrees that someone can be ignorant and still write good poetry.
That's a pretty big admission.
It is. He says that's exactly the problem. If you can do something well without knowledge, then it can't be truly good.
So now this idea of mimesis as copying images has really taken over, right? It's not so much about impersonation anymore.
Yeah. And to kind of tie those two ideas together, he says that poetry harms the soul.
How?
Well, he says the illusions in poetry make the irrational parts of the soul stronger and the rational part weaker. He uses this analogy of being tricked by a painting of a table, like part of you knows it's not a real table, but another part still gets fooled.
So it's playing on that conflict within us, right?
Exactly. And this is all built on the idea from Book 4 that true inner justice comes from a balance between reason, spirit, and desires. So if poetry messes up that balance, it leads to bad stuff. to unhappiness.
I see. And although he doesn't say which part of the soul is being affected by the illusions in Book 10, it's got to be connected to his descriptions in Books 8 and 9, right?
Oh, totally. Remember the tyrant's soul. That was the worst kind. And it was described as being at the third remove from truth and happiness.
Yeah, I remember.
Well, Book 10 calls the imitator third from the king and from the truth. It's the same language.
Oh, wow. You're right. So he's connecting mimesis with those bad desires, with being attracted to fake appearances and illusions.
Exactly. And he also says that tragedy almost never shows truly good characters. The typical tragic hero, he says, is impulsive, acts without thinking, goes against reason. Like when they're over the top grieving in public.
Right, right. And we, the audience, get swept up in it, even if we know it's not rational.
Exactly. We start to develop bad habits, indulging our emotions without thinking.
Got it. So for Plato, the main thing that poetry imitates is human characters.
Yeah, people doing things. And it's interesting, in the Laws, he's worried that because there are so many different characters in a play, each with their own perspective, you can't really learn any universal truths from it.
It becomes too messy, too subjective.
Right.
Okay, so we've got this deep dive into mimesis in the Republic. But then there's the sophist.
Ah, yeah, that one throws a bit of a wrench in things, doesn't it?
It does. In the sophist, the goal is to define what a sophist is. And they end up calling him both an imitator, mimetes, and a sorcerer, goetes.
Kind of like a Republic Book 10 all over again.
Right. The sophist also makes fun of imitation for creating a whole world of fake appearances, saying it's all about misleading the audience. And it contrasts that with divine creation, with things like dreams and shadows, idola.
But there's one key difference. The sophist makes a distinction between a true likeness, a katasia, and a fake, illusory image, phantasma. Like, when someone makes a realistic statue, they're focused on how it looks, not on copying the true form perfectly.
So some imitations are better than others.
I guess so.
Yeah.
But even then, the sophist doesn't really use reliable imitation to define the sophist or the poet. It's more like it's still not a good thing.
Got it.
And then the sophist gets even more specific. It defines mimesis as using your voice and body to act out these fake images.
So now acting is just a type of image making.
Yeah. And mimesis, in this very narrow sense, is a bad thing, a lying art.
So we have mimesis as impersonation, mimesis as image making, and even mimesis as a positive thing, like when the Timaeus talks about the universe as an imitation of the perfect model.
Yeah, don't forget how he talks about learning as a kind of imitation or political constitutions as copies of moral truths in the statesman.
It's almost like he's using the same word to mean completely different things.
Right. It makes it really tough to figure out what Plato actually thinks about mimesis. And some scholars have pointed out that there isn't just one negative view of it in Plato. Stephen Halliwell, for example, argues that there's no single definition of mimesis that runs through all the dialogues.
So maybe instead of trying to find one definition, we need to ask a different question. Like, why is he so concerned about the mimesis of humans specifically?
Yeah. If imitating people is just producing a fake image, where does that put poetry on that whole divided line thing?
Right from the Republic, where you've got the shadows and reflections as the lowest forms of knowledge.
Yeah. Does mimesis just lead to ignorance? Or does it actually make you want to be ignorant?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And it leads to another problem. If mimesis is so bad for you, why do we love it so much? It's like this aesthetic problem of evil.
I like that.
And what's interesting is that in Book 10, when he's trying to explain why poetry is so seductive, he uses all this language of magic, counter charms, sorcerers, spells. It's like this irrational attraction. But what's really striking is that he doesn't mention divine inspiration at all.
Huh. You'd think that would be front and center, given how much he talks about it elsewhere.
Exactly. And that makes us wonder, what's the connection between his ideas about imitation and inspiration? Are they totally separate, or is there something more going on?
All right, so let's dive into divine inspiration. At its core, it's this idea that poets get help from the gods when they create.
Right. It's like they receive special information or talent that they wouldn't have on their own. And this was a big idea even before Plato, right? Think Homer and Hesiod talking about the muses. And even Aristotle picks up on it later.
Yeah. But Plato adds his own twist. He links divine inspiration with a kind of madness, a divine frenzy.
Ah, the old genius and madness connection. That idea has stuck around for a long time.
For sure. And we see this idea popping up in different ways throughout his dialogues. In the Apology, Socrates talks about how he tried to learn from poets, but they couldn't explain their own work. They seemed wise, but they didn't actually have knowledge. Sophia. So he concludes they're working through instinct, through inspiration, enthusiasantes, like prophets.
So they're speaking truth, but they don't know why it's true.
Right. And in the laws, he connects inspiration to drama specifically. He says that because drama shows all these different perspectives, often contradicting each other, the poet, who's sitting on the muse's tripod and not in his right mind, ends up contradicting himself.
It's like the poet is just a mouthpiece for the muses, not a source of knowledge himself.
Exactly. And this reinforces the idea that mimesis, especially in drama, doesn't lead to truth. But there's this interesting twist. He puts the poet on the muse's tripod. That thing is associated with the priestesses at Delphi, with prophecy and divine wisdom.
So there's this hint that maybe inspiration can be connected to wisdom.
Yeah. And in other parts of the laws, he says that even historical facts come from poets who are inspired by the muses. And get this, he even credits philosophical discussions to divine inspiration. Remember the Meno. Inspiration is the example he uses for someone speaking truth without having knowledge. He even calls poets divine.
Whoa. So he's saying inspiration can actually guarantee that something's true, even if the poet doesn't understand it.
It seems that way.
Yeah.
Which brings us to the Ion, the dialogue, where he really goes deep on artistic inspiration.
Right. This one's all about Ion, the rhapsode who performs Homer.
Exactly. And while he does mention other art forms like painting and sculpture, the Ion is really focused on what it means to be possessed, to be irrational, in the context of performing poetry.
Not so much about writing it.
Not so much, no. So the conversation between Socrates and Ion goes through these three stages. First, Ion is obsessed with Homer and only Homer.
Okay.
Second, Socrates says that Ion's ability to interpret Homer comes from divine inspiration. And third, Ion admits he doesn't know anything about the stuff that Homer talks about in his poems.
Interesting. So Socrates is basically saying that Ion's single-minded focus on Homer means it has to be some kind of divine thing, not just skill.
Right, it's not technique, professional expertise. And to explain this, he uses that famous analogy of the magnet and the iron rings.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that word.
The muses are the magnet, the poets are the first rings that get pulled in, then the rhapsodes like Ion are the next rings, and then the audience is the final set of rings. It's a powerful image of how this charisma, this power, flows from the gods.
But it also suggests that the poets and the rhapsodes don't have any power of their own.
Exactly. It all comes from the muses. And then Socrates goes even further and says that truly great epic poets are literally possessed when they compose. And theoiontes kai katechemenoi. He's basically saying it's irrational.
Wow. And how does Ion react to that?
He pushes back. He doesn't like the idea of being katechomenos, kaimonomenos, possessed and mad.
So Plato's linking inspiration with madness, and Ion's not having it. But that magnet analogy is pretty clever.
It is. But it's interesting how Plato kind of twists the image to fit his argument. The way he describes the rings, they're hanging in this neat line, each one only connected to the one above it.
Okay, I see.
It's like it emphasizes how Ion only knows about Homer, not about anything else. It's the opposite of how we usually think of knowledge, where you learn from lots of different sources and can apply it to different situations. So the analogy is actually reinforcing this idea that inspiration is a limited, isolated kind of madness.
Ah, it's sneaky. So what's the Ion's final verdict on inspired poetry? Is it good or bad?
Well, that's the thing. It's really ambiguous. Some people think it's a complete takedown of inspiration. But we also have to remember that Plato wouldn't just disrespect the gods. And Socrates himself actually praises a hymn to the muses as a perfect example of inspired verse.
That is odd.
And he even says that diviners who are also possessed are practitioners of a techne.
Okay, so maybe madness doesn't always mean something bad for Plato. Maybe it's like a different kind of understanding, something that goes beyond normal rationality.
Right. The Ion doesn't give us a clear answer, but in the Phaedrus, we get a much broader, more nuanced view of this whole madness thing. And in that dialogue, some forms of divinely sent madness are actually good.
Oh, tell me more. This sounds interesting.
Well, he divides mania madness into two types, the diseased kind and the divinely sent kind.
Makes sense.
And then he breaks down divine madness into four categories: the madness of love, Dionysian frenzy, prophetic pronouncements, and wait for it, the inspiration of poets, enthusiasm.
Wow, so poetic inspiration is right up there with prophecy and the frenzy of Dionysus.
Yeah. And he says all these forms of madness allow people to do things that normal, rational folks can't.
And they're all connected to specific gods and goddesses, right?
Right. It's all part of traditional Greek religion. And unlike the Ion, the Phaedrus doesn't say that inspiration makes you focus on just one thing. He links the madness of love to the soul's vision of the forms before we were born.
Oh, wow. So maybe inspired poetry can also connect us to those higher realities. Maybe it does have some philosophical value.
Maybe so. But even in the Phaedrus, Plato's still picky about what kind of poetry he likes. It's not the mimesis kind that gets his approval.
Right, the imitative poetry we were talking about earlier. So what does he like?
When he ranks the different types of souls, the poet, the ghost, comes in sixth, way below the philosopher. And he says the best poetry is the kind that praises gods and heroes, hymns, and encomia.
Okay, so that's consistent with the exceptions he made in the Republic.
Exactly. So even though he's more positive about divine madness in the Phaedrus, he still seems to be saying that only certain kinds of poetry are actually good, and it's not the imitative kind.
Okay, so taking a step back and looking at this whole big picture of imitation, inspiration, beauty, what can we say about how these things fit together for Plato?
Well, one thing that stands out is that mimesis often seems to fail because it's rooted in appearances. It keeps the soul focused on how things look instead of on true reality.
Right, and that's why he prefers the older symbolic forms of art, the ones that try to point to something beyond the visible world.
Exactly. And then you've got beauty, which as a form comes from the realm of pure ideas and draws the soul toward philosophical thought.
It's not like mimesis is always bad, right? There are times when it seems helpful for philosophy, like in the process of recollection, or when we're trying to become more like the divine.
Right. And that's where inspiration comes in. It's like this separate force that can actually lead to enlightenment, unlike mimetic poetry, which is often the target of his criticism.
It's interesting how even in the Republic, where he's pretty harsh on poetry, he still uses examples from existing poems to make his arguments, like the noble lie, which comes from Hesiod. And scholars have pointed out how much he actually engages with poets like Aeschylus throughout his work.